The way that I like to frame these questions, and I come from a background as a journalist, is what failures allowed you to find success? And what did you learn from those failures? Steve Jobs, we don't remember this about him. It's something that history tends to forget because these are uncomfortable truths about what it takes to win in life. Steve Jobs was nearly bankrupt in the early 1990s. He was almost out of money. He was down, according to the people who know him, down to his last $150 million, which sounds like a lot of money to us, but he was burning $50 million a year. So he only had 3 more years of cash. He had no investors. They all abandoned him because he was losing money. His products were failing one after another. And this was his final chance. He knew it. His friends knew it. If these failures in this period of his life had continued, he would have been written out of history. And there would be no Apple today as we know it. Apple would have probably gone out of business because he would not have been able to return to Apple and make it great again.
I hope you're enjoying our business biography series and this book, brilliant book on Steve Jobs in Exile. It's with thanks to our friends at Kyndryl who run and reimagine the technology system that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute, KYNDRYL, at Kyndryl.com. Today's book tells the largely unexplored story of the dozen years Steve Jobs spent building NeXT computer in the aftermath of his firing from Apple, the company he founded in 1985. This period would see Jobs at his most creative, most vulnerable, and most intense. It would redefine him as a designer and a leader, ultimately leading to the later resurgence and dominance of Apple following his triumphant return. Yet, this crucial period remains woefully undercovered. And I might add, and I'm going to pick up a different book, we're not covering this book because in a way, when you read today's book, you realize this book was very much edited and very much controlled the corporate narrative. Today's book tells a totally different story, using a treasure trove of new material, including dozens of hours of unbroadcast footage of Jobs at NeXT meetings, retreats, new interviews, and unpublished oral histories with Jobs and his colleagues, new first-hand material, and countless internal documents. This book is the definitive history of the most remarkable period in the life of Steve Jobs. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of Steve Jobs in Exile, The Untold Story of NeXT, and the Remaking of a Technology Visionary. Geoffrey Cain, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Aidan. Good to see you.
Great to have you with us, man. I want to tell our audience, I had organized to interview Geoffrey about his other brilliant book about Samsung. And in the meantime, he has a baby girl. Congratulations for that,
Thank
man.
you. Appreciate it.
And then he drops this baby on the world too. And man, is it such an eye-opener because it tells you the true story. And maybe we'll start off and share about the amazing access to sources, the source materials you had for this, and maybe talk about the difference between that book and the Jobs Isaacson story, because this is the unvarnished version.
Aidan, good question. The original Walter Isaacson biography, Steve Jobs, is the first history. This is the first time that Steve Jobs had given his notebooks, old audio recordings, all his old files, his interviews to Walter Isaacson, who is one of the leading biographers of our generation. So certainly a major work of history. It's a book that tells the story of Steve and his journey from Apple to Apple, you could say, that he started out as this bratty visionary who certainly was very intelligent, creative, had great ideas that he wanted to put out in the world. And he was fired from Apple in the end, went on this detour into NeXT Computer and Pixar, and then returned to Apple and was triumphant. Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson is the big book on Steve Jobs. That's the first book. And since then, there have been more biographies that build on what Walter Isaacson accomplished. So my book, Steve Jobs in Exile, is the latest of the Steve Jobs biographies, but I have taken a different track. I've been looking at this from a different angle. And the question I was asking is, what happens when a visionary like Steve Jobs, who is the king of entrepreneurs, this person who is the greatest hero, if you're in technology or business, you study his life, you study his products, you study his creativity, his decision-making processes in business schools, in corporate boardrooms, among CEOs. This is the man who they know, and they swear that they know his story. But the question I wanted to ask is, what is it like to be Steve Jobs when you're failing? What did Steve Jobs have to do to become the Steve Jobs who we all know? And every hero out there, you look at any hero in our society, both fiction and nonfiction, you can look at ancient mythology, you can look at even Star Wars, you can look at Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. Everybody who has made a mark on the world, almost everybody, has gone through the wilderness at some point. And what do I mean by wilderness? The wilderness is the time when you are facing your greatest tests, when you are learning what it takes to be a leader. And it's a period that so many great leaders have to pass through before they can truly tap into their real power. So this is a book about what it takes to lead Apple, what it takes to become Steve Jobs. A lot of people have that creativity in them. A lot of people are brilliant, but they don't go through those wilderness years. And that's why they never tap into their true power. Steve Jobs found that, and he found that at his company called NeXT Computer. And that's what the book is about.
Brilliant, man. And I was sharing with you before, I'm writing my current book, and the whole idea is that when you whitewash or varnish the stories like has been done, and whether it was done or not, I mean, it's done brilliantly by Isaacson, and it's no disregard to that or disrespect to the work that he's done, but it's not helpful for people who strive. And we talked about this concept of survivorship bias, where you pick the few that survive as the exemplar, and it is not helpful for anybody else trying to strive for that genius or that accomplishment. And in a way, that's what was done with Jobs. And when you read your book, you see very much how close he was to failure, how badly he treated many of his colleagues, how badly he treated many of his suppliers and people who wanted to collaborate. And just the fact that he had this vision didn't mean that he was a brilliant leader, didn't mean that he was a brilliant business person. In fact, in many ways, if you're a good person and you try to lead to a certain amount of morals, you couldn't have done what Steve Jobs did and survived. And he's lucky because a couple of things went his way. There's a lot in there, but maybe you want to share that theme of the idea of survivorship bias.
You look at famous people today, successful people. As a society, we tend to bias ourselves towards their successes. We ask, how did you make this successful thing? How did you make this beautiful painting? How did you make this wonderful product, this iPhone? How did you lead your country to victory? These are the things that we often ask, especially as journalists, and that is what survivorship bias is. But not many people step back and look a little bit earlier. So the way that I like to frame these questions, and I come from a background as a journalist, is what failures allowed you to find success? And what did you learn from those failures? Steve Jobs, we don't remember this about him. It's something that history tends to forget because these are uncomfortable truths about what it takes to win in life. Steve Jobs was nearly bankrupt in the early 1990s. He was almost out of money. He was down, according to the people who know him, down to his last $150 million, which sounds like a lot of money to us, but he was burning $50 million a year. So he only had 3 more years of cash. He had no investors. They all abandoned him because he was losing money. His products were failing one after another. And this was his final chance. He knew it. His friends knew it. If these failures in this period of his life had continued, he would have been written out of history. And there would be no Apple today as we know it. Apple would have probably gone out of business because he would not have been able to return to Apple and make it great again. This is an example of a story where, NeXT Computer is a company in which so much of the technology that we use at Apple now, especially the software, comes from NeXT and comes from what Steve learned at NeXT. But if anything had gone just slightly differently, if the trajectory had changed at certain points and Steve had done something differently, our entire technological world today would be radically different. We would not have the iPhone as we know it. We would not have the same smartphones. We wouldn't have the same operating systems. Even the way that we create software, the way that we create apps, and the way that we create these user interfaces, everything would be transformed in some different system that we wouldn't even know about. And Steve Jobs would just be a footnote. He would be one of those guys somewhere in a history book that you come across, but doesn't really matter quite as much. It's only because Steve, through a mixture of perseverance, of an ability to learn, to absorb those lessons, and a bit of luck, that's why he was able to become the Steve Jobs who we now know.
I love that, and I think it's such an important aspect. I often think about this idea of quantum universe, and there's several variations or multiple variations of the same track going on. And what you said there, I thought about how Henry Ford had initially looked to have an electric car, and it was only because the market wanted gasoline or whatever happened, and we have gasoline, and you go, well, what would have that meant to the environment? What would that meant to oil as a supply across the world? And that's one of the things I took from this book, was that those things and the drive and the pain that he was to work with, demanding things from software engineers, leaning over their shoulders, as you tell us, asking them to change things when they're in the middle of things under unbelievably tight deadlines, and how it redirected the course of history. But I thought we'd share about the origin, where you pick up the story. So the story picks up, it's April 11, 1985, only 2 years after Jobs has recruited John Sculley, and Sculley has organized to fire Jobs. And just to put this in context, at the time, Apple was also failing, and Steve had entered into secret talks to sell Apple to General Electric. A lot of people won't know that. Maybe we'll pick up the story from there.
Apple was hitting one of its worst years in 1985, which was the year that Steve Jobs was being sidelined. What had happened is that Steve had recruited John Sculley, the former PepsiCo CEO. There's the famous line, do you want to come join me and change the world, or do you want to make sugar water the rest of your life? And John Sculley said, of course, I'm going to join Steve Jobs because this man is charismatic, he's brilliant, and he's changing the world with his computers. But what John realized upon getting deeper into Apple as its new CEO was that Steve was horrific to work with. He was a monster in these early years. He was immature, certainly brilliant, certainly visionary, but immature, unable to work with people, crass. He would fire people on the spot, scream at them, yell at them, tell them that they're not good enough. He was not the kind of leader who people at Apple wanted to work with. And what made it worse, this is something that in the history tends to forget, is that the original Macintosh and the early computers that Steve envisioned did not do well on the market. He had his brilliant vision. He wanted to put his vision out into the world, but he wasn't thinking about what people really needed from these computers. It was more of an ego trip for him, unfortunately. And so what ended up happening in 1985, the spring of 1985, is when things started going south between John and Steve. John said that Steve was getting out of control. He needed to be brought back in. John was the CEO. Steve, and this is something that we tend to forget, Steve was not the CEO of Apple. He was the chairman of the board, but he only led the Macintosh unit, and he was behaving as if Apple were his company. But John Sculley and the people around him said, Steve, this is not your company. Yes, you were a co-founder, but you have to work with teams. And so John eventually got the board together, said, look, this is not working. I cannot have Steve interfering with my job as CEO. He needs to be brought to heel, and I am the boss here, and this is the company that I'm going to lead. And the board sided with John. So Steve was sent off into a kind of exile that summer. Not the full exile of this book quite yet, but the exile of the summer of 1985, when he had been stripped of all actual authority at Apple. He was being shunned because he was seen as an outcast in Silicon Valley. And these are the interesting, quiet moments that we often overlook in the life of Steve Jobs. We tend to think of those keynotes and the brilliant presentations he gave and the applauding crowds. But this period of his life when he was suddenly exiled by the company he co-founded became something different because it started off in quietude. He was sitting outside of his home at night, looking up at the stars, trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He had a girlfriend named Tina. They went off to Europe together. They were wandering the streets of Italy. They even entertained staying in Europe together, maybe making that his future. Steve thought about returning to the U.S. He considered entering politics, decided that he didn't want to because he had never even voted in his life. And he was just like, I don't know anything about politics. So it's a really unusual time in the life of Steve Jobs because you really see a man adrift, a man who history remembers as a great visionary, but a man who was deeply uncertain about his own future and the things that he was creating. It took a while for Steve to recollect himself and to get his bearings back together. But it was this summer of 1985 that set the stage. And it's one of those summers, the people who were there with Steve said that he was a different Steve. He was adrift. He was gone. They didn't really know where he was going, but he wasn't the man who could command a room. He was the man who just wasn't sure if he wanted to do this anymore. And if he decided that he didn't want to do this anymore, he would have gone off to Europe and just become an expat in Italy or France or somewhere looking at paintings.
And in some quantum universe, he did that.
Yeah, there's some alternate universe out there where there's an elderly Steve Jobs with a long beard taking art lessons in Paris right now.
He has an orchard of apples, not Apple computers.
It's like brilliant, yeah.
But one of the people I thought was interesting was the Mac financial controller, Susan Barnes. And she previously reported to Jobs, and now he was gone. And Apple rented an office across the road. And she said it was amazing to see how ostracized he was. And she felt it was really cruel. And it made me think, and I'm sure you've worked with people like this or witnessed people like this, Geoffrey, who, when they're in positions of power, people obey and talk to them and come see them and they're around them. And then either they lose their job in some reshuffling in a reorg, or they retire and nobody calls them, nobody shows up to them, and they're like, thank God that person's gone. In a way, that's what happened, Jobs, in this period.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that close and up front, too. I used to work in Washington, D.C. government circles, and that's just a fact of life. One day you're the rooster on the block, and the next day you're the feather duster. And that's what happened to Steve Jobs this summer. One day he was at the top of the world. He was on the cover of magazines and on TV. He was a celebrity in those early days, but suddenly when he was fired, all that came crashing down, and it really led him adrift into this world of internal questioning, of a kind of internal strife, I think. Steve talked about that summer. There are interviews with him, and he said that he felt like he had been punched in the gut and the pain was just unbearable, that he had spent the whole summer just having that feeling in his gut. He said these things. It's one of these facts of life that I think that a lot of us have to go through at some point, and it's the realization that the success and the fame you have now, it's not guaranteed forever. It's necessarily often a fleeting kind of success, and the good times roll, but the good times might not last. Love it while you have it, but you might not be where you are forever.
There's a couple of characters I'd love to share, and I have a weekly article I call The Thursday Thought, and The Thursday Thought, actually, the origin came from this blog that I followed for a long time called The Monday Note, and it's by a guy called Frederic Fidou and a guy called Jean-Louis Gassée. And Gassée is an interesting character. He shows up in Apple and very much antagonizes Steve as well. Maybe we'll share a little bit about him.
Jean-Louis Gassée is, you could call him the Steve Jobs of his day. He was the alternate Steve Jobs. If Steve Jobs had not become who he was eventually, Jean-Louis Gassée would have been certainly second in line at most, or at minimum. And so anyway, so Jean-Louis Gassée was the head of Apple's France subsidiary. The French subsidiary was the highest performing one in the world outside the US. And so Jean-Louis Gassée was really a star in the company. He was approached by John Sculley, the CEO, to come into Apple and to be the new Steve Jobs after Steve Jobs had been sidelined. And John Sculley has said this directly in interviews. He said that he saw Jean-Louis Gassée as the next Steve. Jean-Louis Gassée, flamboyant, charismatic character, fascinating guy. Interviewed him for the book. He is very smart. He is articulate speaker. He knows how to use just the right touch on the things he says. And
Je ne sais quoi.
Yeah, the je ne sais quoi, as the book says. And during this time in his life, he had a wonderful sense of fashion. He was on the front cover of French men's fashion magazines. He really was a charismatic person who came in and took over the Apple marketing division. So he was brought in when Steve was sidelined, but then promoted to a higher level title than what Steve had. And Jean-Louis Gassée, he went in there and he had a new vision for Apple. He wanted to do this thing called Open Mac. The Open Mac was different from Steve's vision. Steve wanted to have a closed system in which you couldn't really take out ports and that sort of thing. Jean-Louis Gassée was bringing in this new regime into Apple that was going to replace the vision of Steve Jobs. That's how his friends saw it. And yeah, he was a rival to Steve. Steve did not like him. There were instances over the years, Steve had called him evil at one point to a journalist. And these two men at this time at Apple, they didn't really get along, and they just saw each other as the opposites of each other, you could say, or something like that. Steve was really annoyed that somebody was coming in to take over his unit, and it was going to be Jean-Louis Gassée, who was charismatic and colorful and could really replace Steve as the spiritual heart and soul of Apple.
It's great. I just wanted to let our audience know it's really worth reading the book to discover these types of characters everywhere throughout the book. One of the really important characters, and he wrote the foreword to the book, a brilliant foreword, is Daniel Lewin. And where he crops up was that Steve, in that wilderness, when he was in Italy, in Paris, traveling around, he decided to put some structure on his thinking, and he wrote down his favorite projects from the last 10 years at Apple. And one of the trends that emerged was his desire his attraction to education-related initiatives. And this is where Daniel appeared, because he was responsible for the education division, one of the most lucrative, and probably saved Apple at a certain point from shutdown. And actually, they went through quarterly losses and factory shutdowns, including here in Ireland. Maybe we'll share a little bit about Daniel, because he comes up time and time again, and also had an interesting postscript after Apple, after NeXT, which was his time in the museum.
Daniel Lewin was the right-hand man to Steve Jobs during this period. He was the man who created something called the Apple University Consortium, and it was an effort to get Apple computers into universities and also to schools, elementary and high schools. The goal was that if you could get Apple into schools, you can find young customers. They'll show their families. Maybe their families will buy some, and these will become lifelong Apple customers. And in a sense, that was correct, because look at what happened. Look at how, at least in the US, Apple computers were in a lot of elementary schools, and a lot of that generation, the millennials, the Gen Xers, they grew up and they became Apple nerds. They loved the iPhone and all that sort of thing. So smart marketing, something, if you're a business student, worth studying as a model to really capture an audience. And Daniel Lewin was the architect of this idea of putting Apple computers in universities. But as a man at the front lines, what he kept finding at universities was that, look, these were not high schools where you only needed a little Macintosh that could type and draw and you could teach students how to use a computer. These were major research institutions where scientists were doing cutting edge laboratory work, and they did not want a little Macintosh necessarily to draw and paint on. They wanted a supercomputer that could handle futuristic modeling at the time, whether that was biology or physics or whatever it might be, they saw this was, remember, you have to remember what technology was like in the 1980s. These kinds of capabilities were so far ahead of the era. It's not like today where you can open any laptop and you have ChatGPT talking to you. This was a time when the leading edge was just starting to come. And the next generation of computers, everybody was predicting, was going to solve some of the greatest scientific questions of our time. So what they told Daniel was, stop. We don't just want to see your little Macintosh. We want to see serious computing power. So bring us that. And what happened with the help of Daniel and other executives and other employees and executives at Apple was that they decided to create a new product called the Big Mac. So this is a Macintosh that was supercharged, something called the 3M machine, which was going to be the next generation of computer at the time. The 3M machine was going to be the one that they would put in these laboratories. But so this was Steve's brainchild. And what ended up happening was that when Steve was sidelined, Jean-Louis Gassée came in and canceled it. So everybody who had been working with Steve on the 3M was so upset, and they decided, you know what, Steve, you've been sidelined. Apple's not working for you anymore. You're 30 years old, which in Steve years is old. He was always a young, successful person. And they said, look, let's go start a new company. Screw Apple. We don't need Apple. Let's do something new here, and let's create this 3M machine that's going to change the world.
Before we go there, because this is a chapter you entitled Mutiny, where these people leave, but I just wanted to give a flavor of almost a red thread throughout the whole book, which is his desire for revenge on John Scully and his desire to show that he's successful apart from Apple and how they're ruining Apple. But meanwhile, inside Apple, after his departure, even though some people were initially happy that he had gone, they chafed under John's staid leadership. They missed Steve's vision and flair and his intensity. And even there, they wore T-shirts saying, "We want our jobs back." Maybe we'll tell a bit of that about that and that ongoing poisonous desire to show Scully's terrible and I'm great.
A lot of what Steve did after he left Apple in September 1985, he founded his company called NeXT Computer, which was going to make these new cutting edge machines for universities specifically. But Steve was starting out on the wrong foot in this journey because he wasn't doing this necessarily to change the world. He said that he was changing the world, but at a deeper level, what he was doing was he was trying to get revenge against Apple and John Scully. So his reasons for founding NeXT were not entirely pure. There was an ego to this. And the people around him talked about this when I interviewed them. They said that Steve wanted nothing more than to get revenge on John Scully and show that he could be a success, that he could beat Apple, that he could beat John, that he was going to show John who's the real genius in here. It's not John, it's Steve. And when you're starting a business, this is not a reason to start a business. Unfortunate. And this is what set up Steve for the troubles that were to come, because he wasn't making decisions because he wanted necessarily to sell a great product. He wasn't thinking about the customer. He wasn't thinking about what the world needs from him. He was really at a fundamental level thinking about what NeXT Computer can do for Steve in the early years. And what NeXT Computer could do for Steve was to give him the satisfaction of being a genius. Steve was essentially building a monument to himself and to his own vision, but failing to think about the people around him who were there helping him, the talent that he was hiring, what the customers needed, what the investors wanted him to do. He was really thinking about himself. And this is an example of the narcissistic leader just getting too out of control and making a series of bad decisions that's going to set them up for failure later.
It's such an important thing to call out, I think, that narcissistic leader, because many leaders of startups or founders don't have the skills they need to lead a company. They may have the skills to find a company, but to actually lead it on, like we saw here with Steve, and it takes a very special type of employee to actually tolerate that. And I wanted to lead here because there's these important people who are the original Nexters, these people who left, and Steve tricked Apple into this. He entered into John's office and handed them an envelope with the low-level employees, I'm doing inverted commas here for people only listening to us, who he wanted to come with him, and this was part of his deal of leaving. It was Rich Page, Donald Lewin, Bud Tribble, Susan Barnes, and George Crow. And John looked up shocked and said, these aren't low-level employees. Let's tell a little bit of a story about how he departed Apple and essentially the lawsuit that happened as a result of that, and how much both Apple and NeXT spent on that lawsuit and eventually what came of it.
Steve was not known in those early years for being, totally honest. He was known to either fudge the truth or outright lie. And one of the things he said going into John Scully's office this one morning in September 1985 was, yes, I'm taking 5 employees with me, but don't worry, they're just low-level employees, so it's going to be okay. But once John saw the list, he said, wait a second, Steve, these are not low-level employees. These are stars in the company. You're taking people who are doing great work. And John just didn't know what to say. So they met with the board, and the board said, look, we can't have this situation. They accused John of not showing enough leadership. They said Steve has just walked off with these employees that we wanted to keep here. And finally, they decided in the end that the only solution was to sue Steve Jobs and another employee named Rich Page. So what's interesting is that one of the first things Apple did was sue Steve, its co-founder, and they didn't even sue NeXT Computer, the company. They actually literally just sued Steve and Rich. One of the first things that happened is as the NeXT Computer founders were all gathering at Steve's house, they were preparing their next steps, preparing the logo, thinking about the name and so forth. Suddenly, a process server shows up from the court and says, okay, you're being sued by Apple. And they're like, for what? We don't even have a product. We don't have anything here. We don't have money in the bank. We literally just registered our name with the California Secretary of State a few years ago. And they were just flabbergasted. And it's like, what is this? It was the kind of situation where it sent chills down the spines of the co-founders of NeXT, because they were asking themselves, did I just make the wrong choice? Am I going to be a part of this company with Steve that's about to go down with a giant legal bill? Apple is retaining every single lawyer in Silicon Valley. Almost nobody wants to represent NeXT Computer, which is an unknown company and is up against it's the David and Goliath battle of Silicon Valley. So it became this fiasco, and they had to defend themselves while having their bank account dried up without even having a product, and figure out a way to prove to a judge in San Jose courthouse, we don't have a product. We can't steal intellectual property from Apple. What is it that we stole when we don't actually have anything that we're selling at the moment? And it was a tough case because they really were fighting the giant of the time. And these giants, they have a lot of lawyers. They have sophisticated case arguments. The case went on for a number of months, and finally it was resolved in the end. But it was it was one of the most stressful times in the lives of these people who were involved at NeXT.
I can imagine just joining a new company and then this is your first task. You haven't even got to the whiteboard of what product you're going to build. But maybe let's go to the conclusion of this. So the lawyers cost Apple $20 million, just to say. It was a huge chunk to take out of this. And Apple wanted to force Steve into building premium high-performance computers only. And for Steve, this was perfect. And maybe we'll wrap this in the story of Brer Rabbit, because that's how you describe it.
So the irony of this lawsuit is that Steve got exactly what he wanted. So Apple was bleeding money dry. At one point, one of the Apple lawyers said that their entire legal budget for the year had just been blasted through with this lawsuit. It was backfiring because it made NeXT Computer look more important than it really was. If Apple's suing them, clearly there's something really big going on here, right? So it actually gave Steve a boost in the media, and he had his sympathizers. And finally, at a certain point, about 5 months into the lawsuit, Apple was throwing court documents at them, throwing subpoenas saying, you have to give us the secrets, show us what you're doing. And NeXT Computer just said, look, we don't have anything to show you because there's no product. So we're going to go on and on. And even at one point, the judge said, this is getting ridiculous. Seriously, come on, guys, just settle. And in the end, Apple approached them with a settlement. And the settlement, ironically, was a victory handed to NeXT Computer, because NeXT Computer, according to the settlement, was allowed to build a high-powered, high-performance computer for the time that would be used for universities. And that's exactly what the plan of the company was in the first place. They were going to build a more powerful computer than Apple. So Steve washed his hands and said, thank you, Apple. And all right, let's get started.
And I'll leave for those, you'll probably be reading this to your newly born daughter at some stage, the story of Brer Rabbit. That's the tale that happens here, that you get exactly what you want while pretending not to want that thing at all. But maybe we'll just rewind a little bit, because when he exited from Apple, he needed two things fast. One, and I often think about this, how much of what he did was driven by this desire for revenge, or the desire to just to show redemption, that he's cleverer than Apple, that he's done well. And he stole off 21.4 million of Apple stock and invested 7 million of his own money. But he did it, importantly, at the worst possible time, and it was a financial disaster. But so driven he was that he ate that loss. And the other thing was, I thought about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like Jobs' hierarchy of revenge. And it was like, he pushed down the enemy, which was Bill Gates. And he even went with a name in 1985, which was NeXT Inc., which was actually a name that Microsoft was using before. Maybe we'll tell a little bit about that.
That's one of the untold stories of this book, the name NeXT. This is not something that was widely known in the life of Steve Jobs back when he was around, but NeXT, so there was a logo designer who he hired to help him choose a name. The name he was originally going to choose was 2, and Steve was thinking 2 is a great name. But the logo designer, his name is Tom Suter, he heard the name 2, and he's, wait a second, you don't want to be number 2 to number 1. You don't want to be the second in line. And who's number 1? That must be Apple, right? So you're shooting yourself in the foot with that name. And so Tom flew to Seattle, and he was at this event with Bill Gates talking. And you have to remember, this is the year 1985. So the CD-ROM is a new concept. People today don't even use them anymore. But Bill Gates was talking about the CD-ROM being the future of storage, the future of computing. And as he was talking, he kept saying the word next. This is going to be the next thing, the next big innovation. People, the next generation of users, they're all going to use CD-ROMs on their computers. They're going to put their games on it and their music, and they're going to put it into their computer, and the computer plays this beautiful music. And the designer, Tom, was sitting there in the audience. He had his little notebook, and he kept thinking, oh, next, that really rings, doesn't it? It's got momentum. So he went back to Steve. He said, I have your name, NeXT. And Steve said, I love it.
One of the things just on the NeXT was, you see, right, so this is a startup. I just wanted to contrast the startup founders. So people like Daniel, who was going through the legal fight at the time with Apple, nearly broke. He had a mortgage, college loans, 2 kids, and a wife who just suffered a medical issue. And what I found really interesting was, and he does this in the forward, Daniel, is to show, yes, we worked for this person. Yes, we may have done financially well, but we had a lot to endure during that time. And in a way, by actually going and following him, you were siding with l'enfant terrible, or the terrible infant, as Donald put it, which was Steve, because at the time it was very difficult because Steve's reputation was poison. So it was a huge lift for these people to go and take Steve's side because it could have been a poison chalice.
That was one of the big downers at the time. A guy like Daniel Lewin. You have to remember, everybody who joined Steve, they were relatively young. They were in their 20s and early 30s for the most part. They had mortgages. They had young kids. They still had university debt, and they had things to take care of. And it's not cheap to live in Palo Alto, California. That's even back then, it was fairly expensive. And by following Steve, they were really betting their futures on somebody who was seen as a fallen star. If, say, the Apple lawsuit, let's say Apple had won or Steve had run out of money from that lawsuit, they would be all out of work. They'd just be failures. They'd be chased out. They wouldn't be able to find a good job anywhere else in the Valley. And one of the things you have to remember about this period is that Silicon Valley was not as nearly as big as it is today. Nowadays, if you're a software developer, you can just move. It's like a revolving door. You just go from job to job and you'll get raises every time. This was a time when there were only a few big companies doing everything. There were some startups, but not that many. And if Apple sued you, fired you, word got around. It got around to IBM. It got to GE. It got to Intel, all the major companies of the day, and you were toast. You would really be pushed out and sent off, maybe back to the East Coast. You go work in a stodgy old office in New York, but you're not welcome among the frontier technologists of the era.
I mentioned there, I was hinting towards his just ignorance towards spend, or maybe you call it ignorance. Maybe it's a good thing. How much he spent and how much he burned through. You were talking about Paul Rand, who designed the logo, those type of people. They all threw in huge, like $100,000 at the time was a lot of dollars. It was much more than it is worth today. But also, even when he went after advancements happening in the computer graphics industry, he went after Pixar, which was George Lucas's company. Maybe we'll share this part because really, this was one of those kind of throwaway investments that really saved him later on.
Pixar was one of his big early investments. What was happening was that George Lucas had a hostile divorce and he owed his ex-wife millions upon millions of dollars. And it was so ruinous that George Lucas had to sell Pixar. Pixar at the time, it was a part of Lucasfilm, the Star Wars company, and it was not profitable. They were making a machine that only sold about 300 computers. It was supposed to design special effects for movies and so forth. But you have to remember that special effects, computer graphics were a very new thing. And it wasn't even clear they were going to become a big thing in Hollywood. So Pixar was struggling. Steve bought it up at a fire sale rate. And it was one of those bets where, at the time it looked a bit crazy because people were asking, who the heck wants to turn on their TV and look at something that a computer created? It's all pixelated garbage. And there was even one, and here's a behind the scenes, an outtake from the book that didn't get in there. There was an event in Beverly Hills that Steve and some of his Pixar executives went to around this time. And they showed one of the early films in the 1980s that Pixar was involved in. I think it was before Tin Toy. Tin Toy was a Oscar-winning film, and I can't remember it was like a demo. I don't remember the details, but they showed it, and the audience watched it. The show finished, and it was just silence in the room, and they were like, "What the heck did we just watch? That's the weirdest thing I've ever seen." So no, like Hollywood did not think Pixar was going to be big. They didn't really see Steve as one of them, and so Steve walks in, makes this deal with George Lucas, and people are saying, Steve, is this really a good idea? You're about to buy a failing computer graphics company. You're spending $7 million to start a company that's going to create workstation computers for universities. You're getting spread thin. It sounds to me like you're just doing this because you want revenge against John Scully. But is this actually your vision? Do you really think this is going to succeed? And Steve insisted it would, but it wasn't clear at the time that it actually would.
It's amazing how those stories appear time and time again. We just covered Nokia as a case study in the show. And in Nokia, the CFO recommended that they buy the networks business that they kind of sold to Ericsson, and nobody wanted to do it. And then they bought it, and now they're back. Nokia are back because they bought that and sold off the mobile phone businesses. And nobody wanted to let go of that identity. And you see this, just the luck. That has to be luck. And it showed up, and as we see later on, it kind of saved Apple in the end when Pixar went on to have great hits like Toy Story. But let's shine a light a little bit on Steve's temperament and how working with Steve demanded a certain type of temperament. Many people listen to this show have worked with people like this, that in a way it's kind of like standing up to a bully, that you stand up. Bullies don't like to be bullied, or they don't like people who could stand up to them. They like people that they can control. And to work with Steve, you had to evangelize for your ideas and for yourself. And the culture was so combative that you tell us that when NeXT veterans moved on to other companies later on, their new colleagues would tell them to dial it back a bit because they'd never seen this type of temperament showing up. But this is where you tell us about the famous hero shithead roller coaster that many, many people went through, and the amount of telling downs people went through. There's so many case studies of this in the book that it's too many to share. Maybe you'll pick some of the examples you like to share.
Okay. The hero shithead roller coaster. Every single NeXT and Apple executive I sat down with for this book talked about the hero shithead roller coaster. That was like the number one topic. They were like, if you don't understand the hero shithead roller coaster, you do not understand Steve Jobs. So what is the hero shithead roller coaster? It's his leadership style, his swings, in which one day you were a hero and the next day you were a shithead. One day you could be making the product that's going to change the world, and Steve was lavishing you with praise and just talking about how great you are, playing you up in the meetings, company meetings. And then suddenly the next day, for whatever reason, you're a shithead. And Steve walks in and tells you you're a shithead. And he says, this is shit. What are you doing? Your product sucks. Your software sucks. Do it this way. Make it better. And then Steve would come back later and check on it, see if it improves. The hero shithead roller coaster was something that had no predictability. You could make a beautiful product and Steve would love it, but you could make a product that you still thought was great and Steve would hate it. And it could be within days of each other. And that's just how he was in these early years. He was mercurial. That's a word that's used about him a lot. But as a result of this hero shithead roller coaster, everybody was on their toes. Steve was the king of the court. And to get anything done, you ultimately had to please Steve. You had to be on Steve's good side. What this did, it created an intense culture, a highly creative culture in which intellectual combat was the way that great ideas pushed through the furnace and got out to the world. So Steve wanted people who could withstand the force of his personality. He would look at them. One of the reasons he would go in and call their product shit was because he actually wanted them to fight back and defend themselves. When Steve was hiring people at NeXT, he would ask them a question. He asked almost everybody this question. He said, are you the best person in your field? And if they said no or hesitated or said, maybe I'm second or third best, he would just kick them out and say, I want to talk to the best person in the field. So don't waste my time. He was asking you that trick question because he wanted to see how you could defend yourself. When Steve said that your ideas sucked, when he said that you're not the best person in your field, he wanted to see you say, Steve, I am the best, and this is why my idea is best, and I'm going to make it as great as it can be. So we're going to get this done. That's what Steve respected in people.
Their team dynamics were difficult as well. I mentioned earlier on the Jobs hierarchy of revenge, but there was also his hierarchy of how he rated people, and it wasn't to do with their skill set, it was their expertise level. So what I mean here is not their level of contribution, but what they did. So, for example, you tell us stuff like software was top of the pile to him, digital hardware team second, and then the bottom was analog. So they were essentially the plumbers, and he disregarded them that way. And as a result, they just didn't have the exposure to him And they were probably reading between the lines, they were treated a lot worse.
So Steve did, in those early years, he had a hierarchy of talent, and his favorite group was software. The reason was because the software group was working on a style of software development that was novel at the time called object-oriented programming. And this is the idea. You have to remember, in the age we're talking about, the 1980s, your typical computer was just a line of code, and you had to code everything by hand. There was no Claude code that could create an app for you on the spot. You literally had to go in there and just do everything, and it would take months, and then there would be one bug and it would crash the whole thing. So object-oriented programming was the next era of programming that Steve was pioneering, and it was this idea that you could develop software as you develop clay, that you could take these things called objects, which were building blocks of software that were pre-made that you could use for anything, and you could put them together and they would interact with each other and they would create beautiful software. So this was software as beauty and software as usability, something that was very new at the time and something that Steve valued highly. So for him, the software team was the killer team because he thought they were the ones who were going to change the world. The digital hardware came second. Typically, it depends on who you talk to, but for the most part, digital hardware was second at the moment. And that was because they were making the beautiful cube computer. And what NeXT computer was known for was this cube design. He had developed an almost perfect cube with identical sides, identical angles, that still sits in museums today as this example of brilliant industrial design. So Steve loved that because it was the computer as art, another idea that was still really novel at the time. But then you get to things like analog hardware engineering. That's, as you said, the plumbing, it's the cords, the plugs, the outlets. Where does that all go? Steve just ignored them. He didn't really care. The one time that he did seem to care about this was an episode. He was going to release a new computer at NeXT, and at the last moment, he told George Crow, one of the guy who headed this unit, that you need to redo the wires because I want to have one wire that connects to the computer and goes into the wall. So any Apple fan out there will immediately recognize that as the iMac. But this was almost 10 years before the iMac. This was Steve's vision. He wanted that computer to have that one plug only because that was beauty. And George said, Steve, you can't do that because we are only X amount of days from launch. And to do plugs and stuff, you have to get regulatory approvals. And there's a lot you have to do. And he just blew up. This is one of the key scenes of the book. And Steve said, okay, this was one of the rare times that Steve at the time started listening to his people and decided to back off. He was realizing that his grand vision wasn't working with everything, and he did have to listen to the experts. But to your point, analog hardware, that's not where the action happened for Steve. That was the bottom priority. But over time, he started realizing that, yes, you can create beauty with this analog hardware. You can create, even a cord can be beautiful. And it doesn't just have to be the software in the screen. It's the whole machine itself.
There's another side which many people who've worked with a founder have experienced as well, which is the double standards, that this rule applies to you, not me. Do as I say, not as I do. And one of those was Steve's. He was so used to a champagne lifestyle. And by that, I mean his corporate expenditure. And one of the things was he dropped 100K on the logo, like I mentioned earlier on. But he had brought that lady, Susan Barnes, who made the comment about him being in exile earlier on, with him as CFO. And she was trying to mind the money, mind the purse. You could see what they were burning through. And despite this, Steve one day pipes up and says, we've stopped nickel and diming. And it all adds up. And then the next thing, 2 months later, and I'll show this on the screen, he takes an ad out in the paper after he learned about Shithead, the famous advertising agency, had been fired by Apple. Let's tell this little story just as an example of how he spent money. You mentioned the cube, for example, how much money they spent on spraying that. Eventually the factory in Fremont, there was so much.
Steve went into NeXT Computer with a grand, globe-changing vision. He went in so we all know Steve Jobs as the scrappy guy in the garage who never took a shower and walked around barefoot. That's the guy we see in the movies. That's the guy we knew. But at this point, Steve Jobs is 30 years old. He's He's starting to age and he's found a taste for luxury. And so at NeXT Computer, he wants to start off as the Mercedes. He doesn't want to start off as the Ford, not like at Apple. He wants to start at the top. And so what that means is that he wants to hire the best logo designer he can find, the best hardware designer he can find. He wants to pay $100,000 for the next logo. He hired Paul Rand, who in this age was one of the most famous logo designers worldwide and actually in history. It designed IBM's logo and many other UPS, many other logos that are still used today. Steve really just went wild with his spending. And what was wild about it was that this was his own money. Usually at companies, if you're not spending your own money, usually it's shareholder money. That's how it works. It's revenue. It's the company's money. But Steve literally would write the checks, pull money out of his account, write the check. And his reasoning was that by starting at the top, he would set the bar high, and that would be what allows the next computing revolution to happen. It's much harder to start at the bottom and to climb your way up as he did at Apple. It's much better to start at the high point of the hill, and then from that hill you can move to other hills more easily without having to descend and ascend. You're at the top already. It was a gamble, and it was a kind of narcissistic gamble. He did have the vision, but it was really about him getting that revenge on John Scully. And it turned out to be a mistake because he was spending all this money betting that perfection would allow for the customers to come to him, that the customers would simply realize, oh, this guy is brilliant and his computer is brilliant. So Steve doesn't have to go out there and sell. Steve expects that these people are going to knock down a path to his doorway. They're going to see this beautiful cube computer, this beautiful object-oriented programming. They're just going to get it. They're going to see his extremely expensive factory. Steve Jobs was making everything in-house from the motherboard to the final product. He assembled his own robot line, like robot hands, making stuff, which is very advanced for the time period. And every robot arm in this factory had to have the exact same shade of gray. And like he spent money, so he hired I.M. Pei, one of the most famous architects in the world, to design a floating staircase in the headquarters. He spent $10,000 on luxury chairs. Like, he really went all out, thinking that by starting at this elite level as a business, that the perfection was going to guarantee success. But that was where things started going south, because that's not what happened. And he ran into the messy realities of the world that, look, people buy products because they want you to solve a problem for them. And, your $10,000 luxury chair is not solving your problem. Your robot arms on the assembly line, yeah, that's all neat. And the computer is beautiful, but how does this giant work of art on my desk actually solve a problem? What can this do that my regular Apple or IBM PC can't do? And that's where he got tripped up. And that's where things started going south.
There's a lot of fake it till you make it here, where he'd made it, but he hadn't made it with this type of machine. And there's a couple of really important points here that you talk about his famous reality distortion field. Many founders, a lot of people have that charisma that people just listen to them and believe them. And he managed to bring some people in. You mentioned about how important this machine could be for academics, but also for governments. And somebody that was very much linked to the government, previous war hero, was Ross Perot. And he eventually gave him 20 million for 16% share. That gave him confidence. That gave him now more money to keep a bit of runway. And also for the employees who probably couldn't believe it at the time. We don't even have a product yet. So maybe let's share a bit about Ross and what he brought to the table and eventually how he ran out of patience.
So Ross Perot was an American war hero. He's also a man who ran for president. He was one of the most popular presidents not from a political party in about a century. And we see American politics today with populism. Ross Perot was the original populist before this whole thing existed. And I say that he was certainly not, and I'm not talking about the toxicity of today, but he was a good guy. He was a great guy who people respected. And So War Hero, there was one point where, okay, so this kind of badass stuff doesn't happen today. In the Iranian Revolution of 1979, he hired a team of commandos, including his own employees, to go into Iran and rescue their employees from an Iranian prison and bust them out. So we're talking Chuck Norris. He's like the Chuck Norris of technology. So Ross Perot comes in, tough as nails. He's this military man and veteran who looks at Steve and sees something in him, the level of creativity that you don't see in many other places. And Ross, against the recommendation of his advisors, decided to bet all this money on Steve. He really thought that Steve was going to be creating the brilliant computer of the future. You have to realize how unusual this was. Today, you can be a company without a product and you can still raise billions of dollars. The economy is so different today. But back then, in the year 1986, it was expected that if an investor was going to write your check, you had to demonstrate results already. So Ross was making just an incredible bet at the time that not many sane investors would have made. And it was because, in part, he was taken in by Steve's charisma. He often said in private conversations that he saw something of himself in Steve, that Steve was somebody who, like, for most people, you have to get to your 50s to get to that level of success, but Steve had accomplished it by his 20s. So clearly he was on the rise and he was going to keep rising. But Ross Perot, he doesn't take prisoners. These guys are tough and you can't fool them for long. The charade was happening. It was clear that the product was being delayed. NeXT Computer was not on track to release a working computer anywhere near the timeline that they had promised. And eventually that charade falls apart and Ross Perot and Steve Jobs were headed towards a collision course. At what point does the investor give up? And at what point does the creator have to drop the fakeness and to show what he's really capable of? And that's what happened in this book.
Maybe we'll say a word on the constant tinkering, delays. Again, many people who have worked with an entrepreneur know what this is like. Leaning over your shoulder, watching your work, being a bottleneck. Stuff all has to go through them. They have to have say, etc., which is important in the early days, but it's not scalable. And you think about here having strategic priorities. And we realized this recently when we covered the BlackBerry story, that the strategic priorities were no more than targets, sales targets. But for NeXT, they called it the deep shit list.
Yep.
And this was Steve going through, what's the thing that's going to put us out of business next that we have to fix?
So Steve's early strategy for the business was, what's going to put us out of business and how can we fix it now? And he ran this thing called the deep shit list, which was a list of problem items that he would list at every single company retreat. He'd have a big whiteboard. And he had two categories typically. One of them was shit list and the other one was deep shit list. And if you had a product on the deep shit list, you were in real deep shit. That was a common phrase at NeXT. If you were on the deep shit list, you were up for, he would march you in front of the room and tear into you. He was not afraid to take prisoners with this one. But the problem became that he was building a company based on negatives and not so much on the positives. He did have the vision for his cube computer, but the way that the company evolved was that it was a company being ruled based on shit lists and the fear of going out of business. They were he would always say, we're running out of money, where our product's not working, stuff isn't working. That's no way to run a company. And that's even what NeXT executives would tell me in interviews, that you can't run an entire company based on the fear of failure. You have to run a company based on the true faith in what you're doing, the faith that the people around you can make it a success and that you can do it together. And so in the first half of NeXT, these early years that we're talking about, Steve was very much a fear-based leader. He thought that he could scare people's way into success, that if we go out of business, you're going to lose your job, so you better pay attention to the deep shit list. But as the story of NeXT went on, this deep shit list started to fade. Steve started to realize that this is no way to run a company. And the way to run a company is that you create priorities, that there are maybe 10 priorities for the week. It's not a shit list. It's not we're going to go out of business, but it's simply, can we apply practical, pragmatic fixes and improvements to make this a better product? So there was a subtle change in mindsets that happened in the next years that showed what Steve was learning. It's going from being reactive to proactive. And once Steve became proactive, he was able to unlock his true magic and to really make things happen.
I really felt that throughout reading this, that this was fueled by bitterness, this project, this next project. And maybe later on, the Apple story was fueled by creativity. It was fueled from a different place. And it just shows you that fuel can get you so far, but you run out of that fuel. While when you change the source of that fuel, it actually can be something different. That's just at a metaphysical level, something that came to mind. And then the other thing, I just wanted to say this to people who are out there who have worked for somebody like this. I have seen people operate like this, like Steve Jobs did, and they do break people and they make people feel worthless. And those people go on to get therapy afterwards. And just to say the people, it's not just you. You can see it at this level. And I think that's one of the important things you call out, Jeff, is how much damage this can do to people as well.
And so many of the people who worked with Steve Jobs, their entire lives, they harbored anger and bitterness towards him. The tantrums, the tirades, the humiliation in front of entire company offices. People really were upset with him. And when Steve died, one of the things that almost everybody told me was that they forgave him because they realized it was hard. They had been angry all those years. They had cried in meetings because of Steve, but they had realized how much he had changed and transformed. And they realized that he had gone from being this monster brat to being able to look at somebody and reach into their soul and pull out the greatness inside them. He found things inside them that they didn't know about themselves. And they all told me, without Steve, without his talent for looking inside me, I would not be who I am today. He brought the best out of me and he showed me what I'm capable of. So they mourned Steve and they missed him. And they missed the fact that we don't really have a lot of leaders like him in the world right now. They want to return to that greatness. So the question a lot of people ask, and this is something that Apple executives ask me and NeXT executives have asked me, it's right now Apple is a company that's struggling. It's not doing as great as it used to. AI, not its thing. Tim Cook stepping down possibly soon as the who's going to be a successor. Nobody knows. But what happened to the vision? What happened to the innovation? And why is it that Apple today is not bringing the best out of the people who work for it? Like, what happened to the old Apple under Steve? And what does it take to lead Apple? And they always go back to NeXT and they say, this was the crucible of Steve's life. And this is where he learned what real greatness takes. And we need to go back to that at Apple now.
Brilliant, man. Maybe we'll just share a couple of more things. And Jeff's kindly agreed to come back for a part 2 of this because we've only got through a tiny amount of the book. It is so deep. There's so many stories and it's such an interesting read. You'll fly through reading it as well. So interested. One of the things on the deep ship list was storage. So if he's going to have this mega computer, it's going to have good storage, and it needed probably a different type of storage. And serendipitously, Canon reached out to Steve to go have a look through our database here of patents, stuff we've been working on, because they saw him as this visionary that would spot something that they didn't. It turned out to be a masterstroke and actually led to investment eventually from Canon.
You have to remember at the time, computers were incredibly basic units. You might have like 2 megabytes on your computer, 4 megabytes. The typical computer in a person's home was not capable of anything like what we have today. And the question was, how can we expand storage to get to that next level of computing for the research, for the science? And Canon was developing a laser disc. This was not like the CD-ROM. It was not a DVD. It was an alternative technology that they were going to start pushing out. Steve was going through the offices of Canon out in Tokyo. They wanted to invite him out because having Steve Jobs around your office, blessing technology, was something that everybody wanted, because if Steve took it, you would assume that it would succeed out there. He would do something with it. And so Steve he caught his eye right away. Like, he saw that disc and he was like, what's that? And he held it up, and it's this gorgeous, shimmering, like a mini disc, not like a CD, but something that's smaller. And it really, at the time, had the look of the future. What really caught Steve with this one was it wasn't only the potential it could hold many more megabytes on one disc, but the beauty of it, the shimmering beauty, the fact that it would whisper to life. It wasn't noisy like the typical hard drive at the time. If you can remember old computers, the discs were really loud. They would make these grinding noises sometimes. But this was true audio and visual beauty bundled together into a little disc. And so Steve bet the future of NeXT on it. He wanted this to be the core of the computer. He said, no hard drives. Now, can you imagine that today, like a computer with no hard drives? It's like, you have to wonder what he was thinking, but this shows like how creatively he was thinking about what he was doing. So Steve bet the farm on this little disc. And this is where things went awry, because the disc was so far ahead of its time that it wasn't going to be able to make it to the market and make any significant difference. It became one of the most expensive components in the computer. It was certainly beautiful, but it was so new that it was untested and it broke down a lot. It only worked on NeXT computers, which meant that you couldn't swap it and use it on your PC or your Mac. You could only use it on NeXT, which is very limiting. And it had a number of other problems too. Office dust would kill it. A lot of them were returned. The typical discs, I learned from I looked through archives that showed that most discs died after a few months, and even the replacement discs also died, the disk drives. It's a product that had so much potential, and it's such a Steve Jobs product because it's so beautiful, but it's not practical. And so this is one of the reasons why NeXT failed early on, was because Steve would not give up on this idea of having this disc. In the end, he put a hard drive on the computer too, not his plan, because the disc was so bad, they had to have a hard drive. So it's like it ruined the whole point of it. And then no one was using the disc when the computer came out because they were just so unreliable. And the whole thing just became a fiasco. So what's the lesson here? Beauty is not enough. Elegance, futurism, these things are great ideas that we can all try to live up to, but you also have to be practical for the times that you live in. And if the industry is going in one direction, sometimes you actually have to follow the industry. You cannot just splinter off and do your own thing. A lot of companies have learned that one the hard way. Also Sony. There are lots of examples of companies that have fallen on this idea of a not invented here syndrome of we're going to have our own tech that nobody else can use. And it did not work for Steve at NeXT. And so what he had to learn was how to be practical, how to build a company that's useful to people, that's practical. And then from there, you can go create your walled garden at Apple later. You have to get the foundations in place first before you can just build your own thing that nobody else can use.
There was an interview with him and Walt Mossberg, and he famously said that Apple betted on technologies in their spring. And I felt here he was trying to force a season before spring and trying to force this technology onto the world as well. Last thing would just be, we've seen how he burned relationships with people. For example, in Fremont, he went through 5 or 6 office managers and used to take the stock back as well. So those people didn't benefit from stock. They just left. And I thought about how many people both were interviewed by him who were burned, and how many people who just went, I've had enough of this over time, including board members over the years. We saw it NeXT as well. But one of the other things he burned, and you see how self-destructive he was, relationships. Some of those relationships, for example, IBM, the business retailer as well, who sold basically an early day warehouse Best Buy type company that sold, and just how critical he was of them, of their practices, looking over their shoulders, even redesigning their PowerPoints.
That was a company called Businessland, and it's one of those big firms that's been forgotten today, but was actually quite important in the life of Steve Jobs. It was a distributor similar to Best Buy, something like that. But what they did, what they were famous for, is that they had a field force. So they wouldn't just sell computers at their shops. They would have this force that would go out and sell you computers for your company, and then they would show up and fix them on demand. This was a major retailer at the time. And Steve was so lucky that they took an interest in NeXT, because this is one of the partnerships that could have made or break the company. But Steve, being Steve, he's still immature at this. He's about 35 at this time. He's still immature. He's not quite learned the lessons of his failures yet. And he immediately moves to alienate Businessland. He tells them, your stores suck. They're ugly. Businessland is a big box retailer. They're selling those old beige computers for cheap. They sell them in bulk to companies. And you have to remember, big companies don't give a shit if your computer is a perfect cube. That's not even something they think about. They just want beige box machine. You turn it on, it works. You type data into it, it works. It can be used across the company. They want portability. They want scale. They want these other things that Steve Jobs is not offering them. The NeXT sales force is extremely tightly controlled. NeXT has these salesmen who go around the country, and they will not let Businessland, their partners, actually sell a computer. These guys, they wouldn't be able to sell it because it's just too hard to sell in the first place. But as the deal would move forward, the NeXT people would come in, take control of the deal, try to sell it for them. But even the NeXT salesman couldn't sell it because it was just like, how do you sell a NeXT computer? So what's the next best solution if the sales force can't do this? You call Steve Jobs. And what is Steve Jobs brilliant at doing? He's brilliant at standing on a stage and telling you why his vision is great and then getting you to sign on the dotted line. So Steve would come out, and they did this thing called Steve on a stick. That's literally the phrase they use. Steve would give his theatrical introduction, talk about how great the NeXT machine is, and then he would sign a deal. They would buy 100 computers or so. That became the lifeline of the business. They were literally selling computers based on the celebrity of Steve Jobs and how much people wanted to be around Steve Jobs. But the actual sales force couldn't sell a computer because they couldn't explain to corporate clients, why does it matter that the cube is a perfect black paint? Who cares? Steve could explain that, but nobody else could.
I will come back, man, because I was just looking at my notes here, and I'm like, you're out of time. You have a young baby there with you as well. I got to leave you in peace. But it is so much more. We're going to come back. I mentioned the reality distortion field that Steve had, but the next piece we'll talk about is when reality distorts back and reality shows up and goes, this ain't working for us. So I will share links to many of the conversations that you had, many of the YouTube videos. But where's people want to reach out and find you, Jeff? Where's the best place?
So I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Cain, Gcain. I'm on X, which is at my name. So Geoffrey_Cain. You can find me at my website, geoffreycain.net. And yeah, I'm always happy to hear from readers. If you have any thoughts, anything that jumps out at you from this book, always happy to hear from you. So just shoot me a message over on X and I'll get back to you.
I'm holding up a copy of the book here. This is not the cover though, so I'm going to flash it up on the screen and show you the cover that is out there. It's a brand new book, been in your mind for a long time, been in the mind of many, many people who've worked for Steve Jobs over the years. The research is fantastic. I also recommend Jeff's other book, Samsung Rising, which we're going to cover in the future when the baby's grown up a little bit and you have a little bit more sleep under the belt as well, Jeff. Author of Steve Jobs in Exile, Geoffrey Cain, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan.
I hope you're enjoying our business biography series. It's with thanks to our friends at Kyndryl who run and reimagine the technology system that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute, KYNDRYL, at kyndryl.com.